Hello there. This lecture is all about group dynamics and organizations, and it's really a nice follow-up to the leadership lecture. So remember, in the leadership lecture, it was focused on how one person's influence impacts work group performance. And leaders also have a substantial impact on how groups form, interact, and make decisions in the workplace. But you have to consider how the characteristics of individuals within the work group impact performance and how those characteristics also impact the relationships that form in groups and the satisfaction among group members. So if you've ever taken a social psychology class, you'll probably be familiar with many of the concepts that I'm going to present. The only difference is that because this is an IO psychology class, the situations that I focus on will be focused on the workplace. After all, work groups serve a psychological purpose by establishing rules and norms for proper behavior and satisfying that human need for social interaction, and it can also provide a sense of belonging. So the topics in this lecture will really focus on the things you see on the screen. So work group characteristics, so looking at different roles or norms within groups. Work group processes like cohesion, conformity, cooperation versus competition. Work group conflict, so the sources, outcomes, and solutions of group conflict. Then I'll take a look at group decision making, so different strategies and issues with group decision making, and then some general guidelines to help you have a more successful or positive experience in group projects or group work assignments. Work groups can take many different forms, and these forms really range from super informal to extremely formal. More informal work groups are often formed for social reasons or maybe in an effort to cope with some undesirable circumstances. So maybe there's a group of employees who have lunch every Friday to just sit around and discuss workplace drama, or even study groups in college would be an informal work group. Now, formal work groups or teams are often formed to perform a complex and specific task. And this complex task really requires people to combine their talents, their energy, and their knowledge to have successful performance and successful outcomes. So, an example of a team would be like a research team that has a principal investigator who just got a $50 million grant from the National Institute of Health. And there's all kinds of different aspects involved with the study, and each member of the team brings a unique skill set to the table. Now, a group is really just comprised of two or more individuals that share common interests or characteristics, and its members identify with each other due to having similar traits. Whereas a team is comprised of employees who work together toward a common goal and then share responsibility for that team's success. And groups really differ from teams in several ways. So the task orientation involved with teams really requires that coordination of tasks and activities to achieve that shared goal. And this often requires a leader. But groups don't really need to focus on specific outcomes or a common purpose. Groups often don't require an agenda or a taskmaster or a leader. Now, sometimes there's actually self-managing teams that are just so competent and focused that they take responsibility for the entire task and really just perform well without the need of a formal supervisor or leader. So that's called a self-managing team. Now, groups and teams also differ with regard to the degree of interdependence among work group members. So, team members are very interdependent. Again, they have unique competencies or resources that are really required to produce a common outcome. Team members possess specific knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics that really complement one another. So maybe some people have good communication skills and others have good problem solving or critical thinking skills and others have good conflict management skills or specific types of like technical knowledge. Now, individuals in a group, not a team, they can be entirely disconnected from one another and they don't really necessarily have to rely on fellow members at all. But they can also, rely on fellow members. It's pretty flexible. Then there's also differences with regard to the degree of formal structure. So when it comes to teams, these individual rules and duties are really specified, and the ways that they're expected to work together are clearly defined. But groups can be informal. They can be formal or informal. And roles don't really need to be assigned, and norms of behavior just kind of develop naturally. So, while all teams are groups of individuals, not all groups are teams. So, teams really are distinguished because they have formal tasks and very specific roles. But for the majority of this lecture, I'm going to refer to teams as work groups and work groups as work groups for this lecture because the term work groups kind of encompasses it all. Now, although work group characteristics are super important, it's also critical to consider the situation. So through this, you need to keep in mind that sometimes really cooperative groups, for instance, could become super competitive when there's a great deal of pressure or maybe a lack of resources. And work group relations can go the opposite direction, right? They can go from being like really contentious and competitive to peaceful and cooperative if there's a substantial change in leadership for the better, or maybe there's an increase of resources, or maybe an improvement in the design of the job, like increasing flexibility or how employees conduct their work. That can turn a work group from being kind of toxic to being really strong and positive. So now let's take a look at roles within groups. So roles really start with role expectations. And within work groups, members tend to play various roles. And different group members tend to have different patterns of behavior and assume different roles within a work group based on role expectations. So employees will really play a particular role within a group because they have certain expectations about the responsibilities and requirements of that role, and they're comfortable assuming those responsibilities and requirements based on their expectations. Now let's look at role differentiation. So figuring out your role in a work group takes time, and as work groups develop, members learn about and take on different and more long-lasting roles. So for instance, a new employee who enters a work group will probably fall into the role of a novice worker. However, that novice may later develop a reputation for having a really good sense of humor and begin to play the jokester who has like comic relief when situations get uncomfortable or boring, right? Like they went from being a novice to serving a really important function. One major differentiation of roles in most work groups is that of the leader versus the follower. So not only can people's roles develop over time, but there's also usually a clear difference between the leader and the follower, especially in formal teams. So, as was discussed in that leadership lecture, leaders are often appointed with a formal title or status, but leaders can emerge in less formal work groups without power dynamics or titles. So, even in groups that aren't necessarily teams, there can be a leader. But the leader in more formal work groups really plays a critical role in directing group activities, being the spokesperson for the group, and deciding which course of action the group should follow. Now, although employees can be designated to play certain roles within a work group, they can perform different roles at different times. So, early researchers outlined a wide range of roles that are really grouped into three categories that you see on the screen. So, they differentiated roles based on being a group task role, so getting the job done, maybe through providing information and resources or recommending solutions and critiquing and evaluating the group's accomplishments. Roles can also be differentiated based on being group building or maintenance roles. So you're really focused on maintaining positive interpersonal relationships among group members. People who are focused on group building promote compromise and will really work hard to settle disputes and maintain peace and harmony within the group. Group builders or maintainers also tend to accept ideas of others and kind of go along with the majority just to keep the peace. Now, some group members have self-centered roles. So they're really just interested in satisfying their own goals over the goals of the group. Self-centered people often seek recognition and can become aggressive when there's competition for resources or disagreement with their perspective. And self-centered employees will really try to control the group and will really just try to incessantly further their own agenda and promote their own status, even if they have to belittle or attack others in their work group to do so. So as you can imagine, self-centered group members can be very detrimental to relationships and the performance of the work group. So although this type of group member may be reacting to the situation, there are certain personality characteristics that should be assessed in the interview and selection process to minimize the number of self-centered work group members hired at your organization. Because think about it, if being self-centered is just a part of somebody's personality, it's going to be really difficult to train that away through job training. So you have to select for it. So there's also within work groups, there's role ambiguity and role conflict, much like you learned in the work stress lecture. So again, role ambiguity is really just having unclear requirements or maybe just a sense of uncertainty about the requirements of a particular role that an individual is expected to play in a work group. So think about group projects, right? So initial meetings for group projects tend to be pretty ambiguous, especially if you're working with people that you don't know yet. But as group members interact more, their roles in the work group start to emerge and be accepted and expected by the group, or maybe rejected and hopefully adapted until you reach a level of comfort in working together. Then there's role conflict. So being expected to perform more than one role with inconsistent or conflicting expectations. And in this situation, when we're talking about work group and work group dynamics, role conflict often occurs when employees are members of different work groups simultaneously. So for example, a high-level executive maybe has a really tight relationship with her subordinates. Like she trusts them and she gives them a great deal of flexibility in how they accomplish their job and what schedules they work. And it's just a really positive environment. She really genuinely cares about her employees. However, she has to be really aggressive and controlling among other executives to maintain their respect and to continue to advance in her career. So what she's doing with her immediate work group and her subordinates is not really compatible with the behavior that she has to maintain when she's working with her colleagues and her equals. So as I mentioned earlier, work groups contain different members with different and shifting roles. However, all group members are expected to adhere to a certain set of group norms or rules that the group adopts to indicate appropriate and inappropriate behavior for group members. Group norms can be formal and documented, like an employee handbook or posted rules, or norms can be informal and unspoken, so like just the informal rule that you never talk about politics or religion at work. Norms actually govern most work activities, including the speed of performance, even appropriate ways to dress, acceptable topics for conversation, and the level of enthusiasm and satisfaction with the job can be governed by norms. Because work groups members' enthusiasm and satisfaction can be kind of contagious, just like negative attitudes can be contagious as well. Now, group leaders are really powerful group members, and they often play an important role in norm formation. A group leader can make an explicit statement or request, like requiring employees to clean their workstation before going home. And this explicit statement or request then leads to a behavioral norm of employees always staying 15 minutes after to clean. Norms can also be based on a work group's history, so maybe avoidance of past disasters or norms that carry over from pre-existing groups. So maybe people who had to avoid the financial crisis did certain things with their business that probably wouldn't be so functional now, even though that's something that they carried over from a past disaster. Now, norms really serve a ton of important purposes for work groups. In fact, norms help groups survive. And norms that specifically develop around performance-related goals or task-related norms really help the group produce enough to ensure the economic success of their work group and their organization. But there are some situations where production rates get too high and there's a threat of a layoff. Then the group members would reduce their output to maintain the current need for employees. So again, norms can shift based on situations. Group norms can lead to having employees who are committed to producing high quality products and services. Norms can also lead to having employees who are creative and innovative if that's a norm within the work group. Also, positive and friendly work group relations can be a norm. These are all good things. Now, sometimes group norms can be counterproductive. So maybe there's just a norm in the work group that people socialize instead of working, or they steal office supplies, or falsify time cards or expenses while traveling. Now, rules and norms also help provide a sense of identity for group members who have the opportunity to express themselves to people that have shared values and beliefs and who are working with them towards shared goals. And the stronger that one's sense of identity is to the group, the stronger their behaviors will adhere to group norms. So, when you're introducing new employees to effective work groups, you need to make sure that you have substantial onboarding and organizational socialization. So remember the socialization and onboarding from the employee training and development lecture. So you want to form this strong sense of identity with this good work group. And onboarding is all about organizational socialization or integrating new employees into work groups. And onboarding really helps new employees develop specific work skills and abilities. It also helps them acquire appropriate role behaviors and have an opportunity to adjust to their new work group's norms and values. And such socialization will really allow that new employee to quickly identify with the group and follow the group norms that led to that group's success in the first place. And then once the employee is socialized, they can become a part of that work group and then they can find their appropriate role within it. So onboarding is really important. Now we're moving on to conformity. And conformity is really just the process of adhering to group norms. And in most situations, norms are so strongly held among work group members that there's a great deal of pressure on all members of the work group to adhere to the norms. And violating a norm can result in subtle or even overt pressure to comply with the rules. And this could be something from a look of disapproval to complete isolation or ostracism of the offensive individual from the work group. Now, once the offender conforms to the norm, that pressure is removed and the person eventually becomes included in normal group activities. But conformity is often very strong in work groups, and this actually helps to maintain order and minimize ambiguity within work groups. Now, despite this strong pressure to conform to group norms, there are situations when individuals who violate a norm and achieve goals that are different from their work group's goals. So maybe there's a new employee in a manufacturing company and he works really hard and he has a higher production rate than the entire work group because he's trying to impress management and get a promotion. However, his work group has become accustomed to this steady but less than optimal rate of production. And the new employee's work group is probably going to quickly turn on that new employee in an effort to get them to adhere to the accepted production rate norms and stop making them look bad or showing the boss that work could be completed at a much higher rate. So again, that pressure to conform. A workgroup member may also violate a norm to demonstrate their disagreement with some accepted behavior within the group. So they may just try to take a stand against something that's harmful or they don't believe in. So if you work in a work group where the norm is that people gossip about each other and you refuse to talk negatively about coworkers, you're taking a stand against those work group norms on purpose. Now, workgroup members that have a history of conformity will be more well received when they violate norms, either for own self-interest or if they're trying to take a stand. So these previous conformers' non-conforming behavior will also have a better chance of being accepted by the group than someone who is known for going against the group on a regular basis. So if you really, really want to take a stand, you're going to have more success if you have conformed in the past and now this is kind of a shock to your work group members who always known you to go along to get along. Now, leaders really have the best chance of resisting the group's conformity pressure, and they have a better chance of persuading the group to change or eliminate norms. So again, leaders are constantly powerful in these group processes. Now, overall, conforming to group norms is pretty functional in the work setting, but sometimes conformity among work group members can really stifle innovation and creativity because people really do not feel comfortable sharing new and diverse ideas or perspectives. Now, cohesion is really the social glue that holds people together in groups. And cohesiveness is a measure of the attraction of the group to its members and the resistance to leave the group. Cohesion really refers to like a sense of team spirit and how much group members coordinate their efforts. Now, compared to members in a really low cohesion group, those in a highly cohesive group will tend to be more satisfied with the group, will interact more frequently, and be more cooperative and friendly with each other. And people in more cohesive groups tend to fully participate in group activities and accept and work towards the group's goals. You can also tell if somebody's in a cohesive group is if they use the word we instead of I when they're discussing their work group. Now, the low cohesive group is typically marked by absenteeism, so just people not showing up or participating. Also, the emergence of cliques or factions, like small groups of people who are competing. And a lack of cohesion can result in a sense of frustration due to the lack of productivity and goal attainment due to a lack of cohesion. Now, although cohesive groups are usually more satisfied than non-cohesive groups, research suggests that workgroup cohesion is really not that strong of a predictor of productivity or performance, unless the reason for the cohesiveness is work-related. So if you have task-related or work-related norms that form that cohesion, then it's going to result in higher performance. So, for example, groups with strong positive work-related norms, such as the willingness to work overtime and taking personal responsibility for doing a good job, are probably going to have better performance than non-cohesive groups. However, cohesive work groups that have members joined together by counterproductive work behaviors are going to have poor performance, even though they have a great deal of satisfaction with group members. So again, task-related, performance-based norms that result in cohesion will also result in higher performance. Now, research suggests that certain job characteristics, such as increased job complexity and autonomy, lead to greater cohesiveness among workgroup members. And then this cohesiveness results in groups being more productive. So another way to improve performance. However, it could be the challenges of the more complex tasks and the group's increased responsibility that causes that group to come together in a way that motivated higher levels of performance. So again, if the reason for cohesion is tied to positive work-related outcomes, performance can be expected to be quite high for those cohesive work groups. Now, there's other ways to design work groups to increase cohesion. So one way is to have a smaller group size. So members in smaller groups have more chances to interact and form close relationships. But as small businesses become larger, gaining more and more employees, cohesion often declines. Now, oftentimes when this happens, the original employees kind of reminisce and lament about that strong cohesion of the earlier, smaller work group, and they miss the good old days. But one way to regain that cohesion that you used to have when you have large work groups is to break those larger work groups into smaller work teams so that they become closer and more cohesive. Another important precursor to work group cohesion is that all the members have a somewhat equivalent status. Now, when there is a status hierarchy or strong power dynamic, lower status employees may feel resentful of those in the higher status. And higher status employees may try to use their authority to control the lower status employees, thus reducing or eroding the cohesion. This kind of dynamic can also result in conflict, but I'll discuss that later. Now, another predictor of cohesive work groups are job enrichment programs that give team members the same classification and job title that can really help increase cohesion by establishing that equivalent status among work group members. Stable group membership is another predictor of cohesion. So the more stable or lasting or enduring the relationship, the more time that group members have to develop strong relationships with one another. And new members tend to disrupt this group cohesion and harmony because they're really unaware of group norms. So, in addition to saving money on selection and training, employee retention is critical for maintaining group cohesion among group members who've worked together for an extended period of time because they feel comfortable with one another and they have accepted group norms. So, it's good to keep your employees so they can work together longer, form more cohesive, stronger group norms. Similarity of group members is also a predictor of work group cohesion, and there's years of research on group processes that suggest that member similarity is a very powerful predictor of work group cohesion. And research suggests that we tend to be attracted to and establish close relationships with people who are similar to us in terms of background, education, attitudes, and interests. Now, it's really important to note that although having similar group members is likely to increase cohesion, such work groups will likely tend to think so much alike that they will have difficulty being creative and developing innovative solutions to problems. Further, research suggests that cohesive and diverse groups generate the most effective solutions to difficult problems. So sometimes the gain in cohesion due to having similar work group members is not worth the loss in diversity, unless you can find a diverse group that's also cohesive, which then results in amazing outcomes. So another thing that can result in cohesive work groups is a common enemy, or this we versus they feeling. So if there's like the presence of an external threat or an enemy, this can increase cohesion as work group members kind of pull together to minimize the threat. Now, this we versus they feeling often has a positive effect on cohesion and effectiveness when the threat is external. So, for example, a startup company may motivate employees by encouraging them to be better than their competitor. Unfortunately, though, this we versus they, or common enemy type of feeling, can develop between the employees and the supervisors or management. And this may actually lead to increased cohesion within the work group, but can be really disruptive if employees are united in going against management's wishes. So it can really interfere with organizational goals. So, in summary, if your goal is to increase cohesion based on work task related goals, you should have small, long-standing work groups whose members have similar levels of power, diverse perspectives that do not violate group norms, and are motivated by overcoming an external threat or proving their organization's worth to competitors. Or maybe trying to prove their work group's worth to other work groups. Or, having that healthy competition. So as you can imagine, the main purpose of work groups and teams is to attain work goals that would be difficult to attain alone. And this often requires that work group members work together, they coordinate their activities, and they cooperate with one another. However, work group members can also be competitive and try to outperform one another, especially if there are limited bonuses, raises, promotions, or other desired rewards and resources. Now, as long as employees hold the same goals, they'll usually cooperate with one another. And people in work groups might also go out of their way to be helpful because of the reciprocity rule, or the idea that favors or good deeds will be returned later. So, reciprocity. So, according to the reciprocity rule, after one cycle of doing a favor for somebody and having them do a favor for you in return, the norm of reciprocity develops and people are more inclined to cooperate and be helpful with one another. Cooperation is also likely to develop among work group members who depend on the skills or efforts of other work group members to perform their jobs. So, in other words, they have task interdependence. And this is really the defining characteristic of teams versus groups, right? So teams have more interdependence than groups. Incentives like raises and bonuses or better assignments that are based on effective group performance can also encourage cooperation because achieving group goals will lead to payoffs for each individual. Now, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of cooperation. Maybe you have some group members who are participating in social loafing. So social loafing is just when work group members refuse to cooperate and they just don't do their fair share of work. So some individuals will not work as hard as they would by themselves simply because they're part of a work group. Now, if a work group member is not passionate about the project and does not really believe that their individual performance will be recognized, then they may be more inclined to slack off and socially loaf. This is especially prevalent if their work group is not very cohesive and other work group members are taking it easy as well. So they may think, hey, if they're going to slack off, I'm not going to work that hard either. Now, it's important to note that social loafing is not the same as someone being overloaded and unable to meet their work related obligations. Social loafing is really the intentional lack of effort based on assuming that others will do the work for you or that your work won't be noticed anyway. Now, competition is the opposite of cooperation and really involves work group members working against one another for personal gain. Now, sometimes competition can be healthy. So, if you're trying to make more sales than your work group to win a prize or bonus, then you're going to sell more things. But competition is often unhealthy and involves people sabotaging or hindering work group members to advance their own status or opportunities. So these destructive forms of competition often lead to conflict among work groups. Now, whereas competition is motivational and has the potential to increase performance, conflict is purposefully designed to interfere with the attainment of goals by other people or groups. Also, competition typically involves competing over attaining the same goal, but conflict is based on incompatible goals. So, an example of conflict would be union and management representatives in a heated negotiation over a new employment contract. And the union cannot attain its goals of increasing wages for employees without layoffs unless management is willing to give up some of its goals, so their short term profit margins. So again, competing goals, not competing to attain the same goal. That's conflict. So conflict can have negative and destructive consequences, but can also be constructive and lead to positive outcomes for work groups as long as the conditions are right. Now, before I go into the outcomes of conflict, let's focus on the different levels and sources of conflict. Now, as I go through this, keep in mind that the prefix intra, intra, means within, whereas the prefix inter, inter, means between or among. So, different levels of conflict, starting with intra-individual or internal conflict. So, conflict is most often thought of as occurring between two people or groups. But it's really important to recognize that people can have internal conflict about incompatible goals, such as conflicting behaviors required at work and family and school and home. Or, a drill sergeant who wants to be sensitive and kind to his 8-year-old daughter and will never yell at his professors in his MBA program, but at work, it's on. So that's intra-individual internal conflict. Now, inter-individual conflict is between two people. And this is often when two people are competing for the same desired outcome that can only be awarded to one person. So for instance, there's only one spot for a promotion and you're competing with somebody else for that spot. Intra-group conflict is between one person or a small subset of the group and other group members. So if an individual violates a group norm, intra-group conflict will likely result. So highly cohesive groups with strong group norms will be more likely to result in intra-group conflict because only a small number of group members will be going against the norms and the majority of group members will be highly motivated to enforce those norms. So now let's move on to intergroup conflict. And this is conflict between two groups. So whereas the intra-group conflict is usually like one or two versus the whole group, intergroup conflict is conflict between two groups that may be closer to the same size. So in organizations, intergroup conflict usually exists between departments. So like HR versus the party planning committee, right? So HR is often seen as the buzzkill because they're aware of all the legal implications of things that are going on. And then the party planning committee just sees that as a bummer, even though HR is just trying to cover their back. Intergroup conflict can also occur between levels of the hierarchy within the organization. So maybe, again, management versus frontline employees or union representatives in a labor dispute. Now, inter-organizational conflict is conflict that takes place between organizations, not within groups at a single organization. So, companies that are competing for the same customers are likely to engage in inter-organizational conflict to achieve higher sales while diminishing the sales of their competitor. So, this can result in healthy competition that provides better goods and services for customers, or it can be super detrimental if services and products are impaired because of disputes. So if you think about like insurance companies denying claims from hospitals automatically the first time in an effort to save money or delay the payment process. So then customers are sent confusing or alarming bills that suggest that their insurance will not cover the services that they received. So this conflict between the insurance company and the hospital is having a negative impact on the customer. In addition to the levels of conflict, there are also a ton of sources of conflict that you see on the slide there. So there's a bunch of reasons or causes for conflict in any work group setting. And some of the primary causes are there on the slide. So one of them would be scarce resources. So too often employees feel that they have to compete for available resources in order to do their job. In a resource scarce environment, this conflict causes tons and tons of problems. Now, poor communication is another source of conflict. So if there's different communication styles, this can lead to misunderstandings between employees or between employees and managers. And this lack of communication can drive conflict underground and make it really difficult to resolve because people aren't discussing it. Another source of conflict are different values. So any workplace is made up of individuals who see the world differently. And conflict occurs when there's a lack of acceptance and understanding of these differences. So another source of conflict would be differing interests. So conflict occurs when individual workers fight for their personal goals and ignore organizational goals or organizational well-being. So another source of conflict could be personality clashes. So again, all work environments are made up of differing people with differing personalities. So unless colleagues understand and accept each other's approach to work and problem solving, conflict will likely occur. And there's also certain people who are just more likely to engage in conflict. Maybe they have a desire to gain at others' expense, or they're unable to control their negative emotions. So personality can result in conflict. Also, poor performance is a stressful situation that can result in conflict. Also, when one or more individuals within the work unit are not performing or working to their full potential, this can harm the group and can result in conflict if that performance deficit is not addressed. Now, although interdependence is good and it's the hallmark of teamwork, interdependence can also be a source of conflict. So if you think about it, the greater the interdependence of work activities, the greater the potential for conflict. Because if work group members depend on each other to do their job, one group member's performance can have a drastic impact on other people. So work group members whose own productivity is hindered by somebody else's mistakes or laziness will likely spiral into a series of conflicts that will probably result in very poor performance. So all these interdependent parts or all these interdependent employees must function together to be successful. And any bump in that system can result in conflict. And I've kind of alluded to this before, but an enemy within the organization or having that we versus they feeling toward entities inside the organization can be a source of conflict. So having this we versus they feeling towards entities outside the organization can foster group cohesion because, nothing brings the group together like a common enemy. But this we versus they feeling within the organization, again, will result in conflict. So, think about wage negotiations between managers and employers. So an employee's low wage increase, or employees want a wage increase, but the manager wants to keep their costs low. So each group views the other as the enemy who is trying to block their goals. And that's within the organization. And this type of conflict pushes groups further away from each other and results in negative outcomes for the organization. So again, conflict in work settings can produce both positive and negative outcomes for the organization. First, I'll present positive outcomes of conflict, and then I'll move on to those negative outcomes. So these positive outcomes of conflict really require strong leadership and effective communication. And with strong leadership and effective communication, conflict can increase motivation. So, one way the conflict can indirectly affect performance is by increasing the motivation and energy level of workgroup members. So, a little bit of conflict can energize workgroup members, which may increase their motivation to perform their jobs. If there is a complete absence of conflict in your workgroup, then you may become unmotivated, bored, and complacent. So, there's kind of a sweet spot for a level of conflict that will increase motivation. Conflict can also stimulate creativity and also innovation. So conflict often arises when people try to challenge an existing system, but oftentimes this type of conflict can result in new and often better ideas. People tend to resist change, but working through that discomfort through having an open dialogue about conflicting views often leads to a better organizational outcomes. It also leads to more work group productivity and overall satisfaction. And conflict, because of this, discussion that takes place, also typically can increase the quality of decisions. So if you give all members of a group some input into the decision-making process, this can lead to conflict because the group must consider many opposing views and opinions. And conflict occurs as each group member tries to be heard and fight for what they think is right. And typically, high quality decisions result from this because of this critical process of sharing, debating, and refining ideas. So now let's go ahead and move on to the negative outcomes of conflict. So one common negative outcome of conflict is that it can reduce group cohesion. So this is probably the most obvious negative outcome of conflict. It's just a reduction in how well people get along and how closely they are bound together. Now, although some conflicts can energize group members, too much conflict can really harm group members' willingness and ability to work with each other. Conflict can also disrupt communication. So it can really have a strong impact on group performance when conflict halts or tampers with effective communication. And people who are in conflict may not want to communicate with each other or may start spreading damaging rumors at the person that they're in conflict with. So in an effort to avoid further conflict, supervisors may no longer allow subordinates to participate in decision-making processes, thus shutting down the ability to communicate about important decisions and probably resulting in perceived injustice about decision making. Now, conflict is especially damaging to performance when group goals become secondary to the conflict. So if there's just too much energy being devoted to the conflict, work group members may neglect to perform their jobs. So in summary, organizations need just the right amount of conflict to keep employees engaged while avoiding dysfunctional relationships. Now let's focus on managing group conflict. So it's really important to manage group conflict and keep an optimal level by resolving negative conflict and stimulating positive conflict. So when conflict becomes destructive, the key to successful conflict resolution is maintaining a broad perspective, trying to find a workable solution, and considering all of the potential side effects of any given solution. So, considering the likely actions of disgruntled employees, for instance. Now, conflict resolution strategies either fall under individual conflict resolution strategies, so conflicting parties just kind of work it out themselves, or managerial conflict resolution strategies, where a manager or supervisor encourages conflict resolution using specific strategies designed to encourage employees to work together effectively. Now, some of these conflict resolution strategies are a win-lose situation. So, forcing employees to work it out and declare a winner results in a winner, and that is implied that there is a loser. Now, using accommodation to resolve conflict is also a win-lose situation because one group just gives in to resolve the conflict. And this is often done to avoid future losses or to save a relationship that's more valuable than the issue that's being resolved through the conflict. Now, there are some conflict resolution strategies that are a lose-lose situation. So compromise is technically a lose-lose because each party must give up something. Again, this is a lose-lose situation because really neither group has achieved its goal. And compromise is only effective if both parties can afford to reduce or adapt their needs and goals. Now, a win-win situation occurs when there's collaboration. So the groups can try to cooperate and reach a mutually beneficial solution. And this is a win-win situation because nobody has to give anything up if they can reach that, again, mutually beneficial solution. But collaboration is really not always possible, especially when the conflict is over scarce resources and there's not enough to satisfy both groups' needs. Something will have to give. Now, another conflict resolution strategy that's primarily geared towards management is avoidance. So, managers may suppress conflict and not allow it to come out into the open while trying to give conflicting groups time to cool off. Now, although this will result in a longer period of time where there is conflict because it's being avoided, this will also result in a lack of ability to work with one another for a period of time. Sometimes, avoidance may be appropriate if the timing for open conflict is just not right, and you're more likely to reach a better solution when, again, things have cooled down a little bit. If the manager's conflict resolution strategies prove to be unsuccessful, the manager may actively resolve the conflict by making a decision in favor of one group. Although this may result in resentment from the losing party, right? The manager could also act as a mediator to resolve conflict in a way that will satisfy both parties, which is very difficult to do. One managerial conflict resolution strategy that seems to be effective is the use of a superordinate or a very important goal that is attractive to both parties. So when a group is split over some minor issue, giving them all a very important and desirable goal that requires them to work together may result to an end in the conflict. So for example, if members of the sales team are fighting for customers to earn that individual-based commission, you can introduce a group-based incentive program that gives bonuses based on sales of the entire work group and not individual employees. So this should reduce the conflict within the group and motivate work group members to cooperate in an effort to outperform other work groups. Now, in certain situations, such as when group members appear to have become complacent or disinterested in work activities, sometimes these situations will result in managers feeling that some type of conflict may be needed. So instead of trying to resolve conflict, they may try to stimulate conflict. So managers can ask employees for their suggestions or complaints about the organizations and its policies, which may lead to some conflict as employees critically evaluate the organization and management. And the hope through this type of conflict stimulation is that there will be a constructive change and improvement in the work environment. Now, if groups become too cohesive and are no longer innovating or feeling motivated, management may break those groups up and bring in new employees with fresh perspectives. And this type of conflict should help stimulate creativity and motivation. Another way to stimulate conflict is through sales and performance-based competitions. So you just have to make sure that any kind of sabotaging is totally discouraged and not tolerated, and that all participants have the opportunity to reach the goal. So that'll make it a more productive type of conflict and not turn into negative conflict. Also, allowing group decision making is really always a good way to stimulate some healthy conflict. All group members have a say in a certain issue, then there's certainly going to be conflict. But the sharing of opinions and arguing about decisions will likely have positive results because everybody is considering a wide range of plans and critiqued all possible decisions. One of the most important processes in work groups is group decision making. And group decision making involves establishing group goals, choosing among various courses of action, selecting new members, and determining standards of appropriate behavior. Groups make decisions in many ways. So think about the decision-making model from the contingency theories of leadership. Tons of different ways to make decisions in groups. But here is a summary of the 4 basic types of decision-making strategies. So autocratic decision-making is the simplest way to make a decision. And this is when the group leader makes the decision alone based on information that only they possess. Now, autocratic decision making is fast, but workgroup members may not agree with the decision, and making decisions in isolation often results in lower quality decisions than decisions made through consulting others. So that leads me to consultative decision making. So this is when the leader gets information from group members to assist in reaching a decision, but the group leader still holds the final say in the decision. So again, this should be some review from that decision-making model in the leadership lecture. Now, also there's democratic decision-making, where all group members are allowed to discuss the decision and then vote on a particular course of action, usually under majority rule. One advantage of democratic decision-making is that decisions are made using the knowledge and experience of all group members, and a great number of alternatives are typically considered. Also, because group members all had a role in the decision making, they may be more likely to follow the chosen course of action. However, democratic decision making is time consuming because it encourages conflict and may result in a disgruntled minority who will resist the decision. Now, finally, there's consensus, and consensus requires that all group members agree on a chosen course of action. This is especially time consuming and should really only be used for very important decisions or when the decision must be extremely high quality, highly critiqued, and supported by all members of the group. Sometimes arriving at a consensus is impossible, particularly if one or more group members have strong resistance to the majority's decision. So like a hung jury, right? It's just impossible to get consensus. Now, the major advantage to group decision making is that it typically results in a higher quality decision. But if there's one person who possesses all the information needed to make that high quality decision, then they'll probably be able to perform as well or better than a group. Now, because group decision making takes time, individual autocratic decisions may be more appropriate in emergency situations. However, for problems that are complex or involve many steps that are required to make a decision, a group decision may actually be faster than an individual decision because the various aspects of the problem can be divided among workgroup members. So it's a good idea to allow group decision making when possible because research really suggests that group decision making results in an increased satisfaction and commitment among workgroup members. And it's really important to consider problems or issues that arise when decisions are made by groups instead of an individual to make sure that that increase in satisfaction and commitment and quality of decision making is worth it. So a primary concern about group decision making is groupthink. So groups typically make high quality decisions because alternative courses of action have been considered. However, groupthink can limit the consideration of alternative decisions. Groupthink really refers to a situation where a very cohesive or relationship-oriented group with strong norms that develop this easy early consensus norm. So this norm that, we usually agree and we agree soon and we have early consensus. So this norm can encourage workgroup members to kind of just go along to get along. So my hope is that you can apply what you've learned here in this lecture to any group project or work assignment, or if you are in a position to form work groups for employees or students. So there are ways to work toward maximizing the situation's potential to foster cohesion within a group and to have more productivity. So smaller group size is key. So try to have a small enough group that communication should be easy so you can keep each other in the loop. Equivalent status also helps because cohesion is most likely when all group members are receiving the same group-based grades or performance evaluations and are equally responsible for the finished product. Also, similarity of group members. So group members with similar goals and interests will be more cohesive. Be careful with work styles though. Having various work styles or roles can provide much needed balance. So like having people in your groups like someone who's a timekeeper, someone who's an organizer, someone else who's a creative thinker, maybe someone who's a cheerleader and keeps people going when things seem grim, maybe even a detailed oriented quality control person. So you want to have similarity in terms of goals and interests, but not necessarily work styles or the way that they tackle a project. Also, it helps to create that we versus they feeling. So, having a friendly competition with other groups to promote cohesion within your group. In addition to forming groups, there are strategies you can use with your groups to promote cohesion and performance. So, one of the big things is avoiding groupthink in your cohesive group by forming strong norms and expectations on day one of the project that all group members agree to. So, maybe striving for consensus in decision making, but also making one of those norms the expectation that group members can speak up and play devil's advocate without being attacked or ostracized. Don't only set that norm, but hold group members accountable to those norms you set on day one and those expectations. Also, try to work as a team, not just a group, that constantly communicates, is able to rely on each other, and works together to come up with ideas and complete work. Set up expectations or norms from the get go that you must be able to communicate and how you're going to communicate and how often you expect replies when you reach out via email or text, and you need to do that as soon as the group forms. Once you work together to develop a detailed strategy and timeline for completion of your project, then try to be a self-managing team where each of you take responsibility for completing the project without the need of a formal group leader guiding activities. Just be sure to constantly check in with one another and ask for help when needed. Again, communication cannot be emphasized enough. And finally, the thing that drives me the most insane is social loafing. So really try to avoid social loafing. You've got to hold group members accountable for specific aspects of the project they are best suited for, and absolutely set norms and expectations that social loafing is not acceptable and nobody else is going to pick up the slack when somebody stops doing their fair share of the work.